When you ask people why they enjoy shooters, it's not uncommon to hear games described as fast. And a game being fast is treated as a good in and of itself. When you see marketing for a game, it'll often describe speed as a pro in favor of it. It is a positive for the game. When people describe why they like a specific game, being fast isn't an uncommon adjective they'll use to describe it. It's almost assumed that a shooter should be fast. When people think of shooters, it's obviously conceived of as a high action genre based around constant action. Of course there are exceptions, but this is the general perception. But how true is this really? How close is this to what people really want? Now, I made a video about aim down sights, and let's just say I heard a lot in response to that. But obviously I wasn't very moved by many of the responses, despite the volume of them. This is because I feel that they didn't address the claims I was making. To attempt to summarize it quickly, ADS is popular and gets pushed into virtually every game. It's a feature that slows down the pace of gameplay, and for many games that just doesn't work. But the feature is forced into the game anyway. Now there's a really simple response to that which I hardly saw in the comments. I won't go as far as to say that nobody brought this up, but I can't recall any comments discussing it. And that is, why is slowing down the pace of a game a bad thing? Now that I think about it, it's quite often a good thing, because slowing down the game can quite often be preferable. Now that isn't some universal. There's a whole genre now that gets hyped. Movement shooters, especially with many indie shooters. It seems an obsession for many. There is an audience for this, but I think there's a larger audience who actually prefer slower shooters, even if that's not what that audience would admit, what they would claim to prefer. Let's look at some examples. Titanfall is a natural example. The shooter basically kicked off the brief advanced movement phase in the middle of the last decade. It was built by ex-Call of Duty developers at Respawn Entertainment, and famously brought all these cool parkour and movement mechanics to first-person shooters. It has a dedicated niche community, but never achieved mass success, at least not before a pretty significant transformation. I always feel bad for giving Titanfall a hard time because it's overall a good game. I liked the campaign. Yes, it didn't launch perfectly, but I think fans of it want to deny that its struggle to continue existing is at least in part down to some design flaws. I just don't think the kids yearn for Titanfall. I always highlight this tweet by Jason McCord, basically outlining some issues. He outright says movement shooters are fun, but not sustainable. They focus on reaction rather than strategy. He said Titanfall is all reactionary, which doesn't scale well to a large player base. Basically, Titanfall's fast-paced gameplay is all sugar. It's super fast-paced, intense action, but burns the average player out quickly. This is reflected fairly well in the player drop-off. Once this happens, a huge skill gap emerges for people who've mastered the finer movement, memorized it, and know it off by heart. Of course, many people replied to this X-Seat, telling him how wrong he is for saying this. Not just disagreeing, but questioning the judgment there. But there's something you need to realize. I'll give some extra context. Jason McCord isn't just some random nobody who was a designer on the most beloved Call of Duty games, both Titanfalls and Apex Legends. He was a lead designer on Titanfall 2 and Apex Legends. People don't realize just how revealing this is about the success of these games. This is probably at least part of why there is no Titanfall 3. And he's not just saying these things arbitrarily. I can almost guarantee this is a conclusion he came to after many years of company playtesting, research and data. I can almost guarantee that he knows his own game inside and out. As it turns out, yes, they did manage to make the Titanfall formula extremely successful, popular and profitable. How? Of course it was by gutting most of the movement mechanics, the Titans placing the player on huge maps in slow matches where you only get into gunfights every 5 minutes and dramatically increasing the time to kill. They made Titanfall work by massively slowing down the pace, by making it not a movement shooter. Remember last decade when there was a moment where every game wanted to be advanced mobility, super fast, high octane, cracked out bruh movement? And then they all abandoned that? Call of Duty ruled shooters. Imagine you went back to that time and told them that the new hot super massive trend would be slow games on massive maps where an average player would be doing well if they got like 15 kills. A game where you could have a chance at first place by literally hiding for like 20 minutes. And yet, Battle Royale dominated and continues to succeed despite proclamations to the contrary. Even the genre that's being hyped as its replacement, the Tarkov clones like Hunt and Marathon, is similarly slow. And they have a lot in common with Battle Royale. They have similar stakes and tension. They have extended breaks between gunfights to pace the game and build tension. They have loot that you can lose. Battle Royale is successful because of pacing. Each game is like a movie that slowly builds up to a climax and a final showdown to determine whether it's a tragedy or a comedy. I mean, it's literally based on a film. Fast shooters, on the contrary, are Michael Bay films, constant action. Arena shooters are a great example. They require a constant degree of attention and focus. If you let up for a moment, you will be punished. It's fun and engaging in short bursts, but tiring for long periods of time. It's a bit like the ancient parable of New Coke. Coke did user research to find a new recipe. They tried different recipes with test audiences using small samples. One recipe stood out as the most preferred. It was the highest rated in the samples. They introduced this recipe as a new product, New Coke, and it was horrible. Everyone hated it. Why was that? It scored so well in tests of the general public, but then the general public hated it upon release. Because the New Coke recipe was sweeter, it had more of a hit in short bursts, like they were getting in a test. People preferred it when they were drinking a small amount, but over a longer period of time it got sickly. People grew sick of New Coke and demanded the original back. Giving too much in a small period of time can burn out the end user far quicker. Counter-Strike came to PC at a time when arena shooters ruled and made a slower, more casual-friendly game, at least compared to what came before. It had mechanics to make it easier than games before. You get extra money after failing rounds. There were long periods between gun battles. You had incentives to slow down, like movement inaccuracy. Your reticle flares whenever you move. Counter-Strike then went on to become the most successful multiplayer shooter ever, and arena shooters went on to die. This is a big one because, again, fashion changes, fads come and go, but Counter-Strike has reigned for 20 years from strength to strength, and it's still growing massively. Think about how many lame COD clones there are out there that get forgotten. Riot Games makes a lame Counter-Strike clone, and even that succeeds hugely. And, of course, because it's a shredded nerd video, Halo. For some reason, I always hear people talk about how slow Halo 3 is. Some people certainly describe all Halo as slow, but I especially see people say this about Halo 3. That's funny, because Halo 3 is the best one. It being slow doesn't affect the quality of the game at all, or how fun the gameplay is. It is one of the best paced in both campaign and multiplayer. I personally don't even find it that slow because all of the level geometry is, built around the player's speed. It's never really hard to get anywhere. It does also have momentum, so when you move, you need to commit to it. If you change direction, it takes a little bit of time to regain your speed. I think what Halo lacks is the appearance of speed. I think that's what people often talk about when they say they want speed in a game. Things like sprint and advanced movement mechanics to make the game look like it's faster. One thing I will say about Halo is that positioning is really important because you can't just easily escape a bad position that you put yourself in. This adds strategy because you have to put thought into every movement. If you walk into a bad situation, it's your fault and you will be punished. It's a part of why I like Halo. It's a shooter that focuses on strategy without being a straight up tactical shooter with low time to kill and all that. And this loops back to the Titanfall thing. There are multiple types of skill. There are, of course, the flashy things, the tricks, the fast movement. These are the immediate examples of skill and skill expression that people think of. But a game doesn't have to be fast to be skillful. Nobody would accuse turn-based games like XCOM or chess of being skillless. There's strategy. Titanfall focused on reaction rather than strategy. I find strategy a far more interesting skill to focus on in a game. Many games have incredibly skillful maneuvers that I personally find boring because they ultimately boil down to rote learning. Doing something a million times until you can do it perfectly, identically, every time. Every game does have things like these to grind for. To be fair, I think Counter-Strike has these especially so, like memorizing every grenade spot in a map, getting the AWP flicks down mid, memorizing spray patterns. It's part of why I don't really enjoy Counter-Strike. That's not to say the game doesn't focus on strategy, not by any means. It still has that important strategic element. It's just those some aspects that some people obviously do enjoy that I personally don't enjoy. I think the main difference between these two types of skill expression is that strategy is about uncertainty, adapting to unexpected scenarios, whereas the reaction and rote learning type is purely about training yourself to do a certain thing, to do a certain action. This is always going to be more compelling, I feel. You can grind out 1,000 hours on improving a certain skill, those 1,000 hours in an empty map, an aim trainer, and with some skills you can even get better at them by not actually playing the game, by just practicing it alone over and over in an empty map. You can also grind out 1,000 hours on improving your strategy. Those 1,000 hours will ultimately be devoted to changing how you think, engaging your mind to react strategically to every scenario. This is something you can't guarantee you'll get good at, and it's a skill that requires more thinking. I'm going to recognize straight away that this is not universal. The market for fast games exists. Just it's perhaps more niche than modern trends would let on, considering every shooter seems concerned with speed. Destiny 2, for example, launched with an unpopular PvP mode because time to kill was higher and the game was a lot slower. The Go Fast update came along and dramatically upped the speed. This makes sense because that's the specific identity that Destiny has and the fantasy it's trying to achieve. It's meant to be about these superpowered, super fast dudes. You're meant to feel that in the gameplay. Call of Duty is always confusing. On the one hand, you see people who hate movement kitties and hate all the new movement options. Now apparently Modern Warfare 2 has slowed down the pace of movement like sliding, and apparently people hate that stuff like slide cancelling being nerfed. When every Call of Duty game was coming out with advanced mobility, players publicly hated it and begged for boots on ground in their games. Then they got a boots on ground game and it fucking sucked. With the newest game, I see COD fans complain about how it sucks and COD is dead, despite the game seeming to do just fine. Every new COD game that comes out is hailed as the greatest thing ever for like a month, and then after that everyone says it's pure garbage. This happens every single time. I think Call of Duty players are just going to consume whatever they get, no matter what, honestly. And I think with the developers of Call of Duty, they're damned if they do, damned if they don't. Of course, single-player games like Ultra Kill and Turbo Overkill stand out as popular indie games. They are single-player, which is important in this scenario. Again, there is a market for fast games, but in a market where it seems like literally every indie shooter wants to be some super fast movement shooter type thing, making a slow and methodical shooter would honestly make your game stand out more. A game that focuses on pacing. Not every game has to be quick. Also of note, speed can mean a few different things. There is just the movement speed, how fast the player moves through the level. Again, this is kind of irrelevant because the size of the level is built around the movement speed of the player. There is the appearance of speed. Movement speed contributes to this, but it also ties into art, animation, and design. There are a lot of effects and mechanics you can implement to make the game appear faster, while not actually affecting much in terms of actual pacing. Then there is the pacing of the game, in addition to all that. This is something that can be influenced by things such as player speed and mechanics. There is the pacing within encounters, between encounters for a whole level, and pacing of the whole game between all the levels. This is, of course, the most important aspect when we talk about speed. A game can be fast-paced within encounters, but it paces those encounters out over a distance. With all that said, my bit of unsolicited advice is as follows. If you want to stand out, do something different. If everyone is going left, go right. When it seems like there's a massive push for super high octane, ultra speed, advanced movement mechanics, try slowing down the game to a more methodical pace. There's probably much more of a market in that than you think. Subscribe and like this video. Thank you for watching. Goodbye. Special thanks to the patrons, Leafa, Will Matty, Lazy the Crazy, Glorious Bees, Maritime Steak 85, Delirious Fool, Topcake Red, and Adam Safranco.